Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into one of humanity's oldest, most complex questions. Can we ever achieve perpetual peace?
We've got a fascinating stack of sources guiding us, centered around Immanuel Kant's groundbreaking 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace.
Right.
But crucially, the sources give us layers of context, pulling in thinkers in history from, well, ancient Greece and Rome through the age of religious wars, the dawn of international law, right up to the challenges of the early 20th century. It's quite a sweep.
It really is a journey through centuries of thinking about, and let's face it, struggling with, war and peace. Our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack Kant's specific blueprint for lasting peace and see how his ideas fit into this massive historical conversation.
Exactly. What do these sources read together tell us about whether perpetual peace is a moral imperative, a reachable ideal, a practical project, or maybe just something we can only ever dream of?
Okay, let's unpack this stack of sources and maybe start right at the beginning with the most basic human condition the sources describe.
Yeah, the sources paint a picture of the earliest stages of human society where, well, quite starkly, war was the rule. Peace, that was the rare exception. Basically, I made it right.
It wasn't large armies clashing yet, was it? More like constant conflict, individual against individual, small group against small group. Sounds exhausting.
It certainly does. And the sources highlight the foundation of the state is the first big step towards changing that. The state emerges as the primary institution for peace, but internally,
Internally, right.
to provide security within its borders, protecting you from your immediate neighbors.
But it doesn't end conflict, it just changes its nature.
Precisely. It transforms war from chaotic individual skirmishes into something systematic, deliberate, conflict between these newly formed communities or nations. The problem essentially scales up.
So looking back at classical times, how did civilizations think about this newly scaled up conflict?
Well, the sources note how the Greeks, for instance, often viewed anyone outside their culture, the barbarians, as, well, natural enemies. Treaties with them were often just temporary breaks in the fighting.
Yeah.
Armistices really, not true lasting peace.
And the Romans had a different approach, right? Trying to build something much bigger.
Yes, the Romans aimed for this vast, world-embracing empire. The hope was that by incorporating everyone into one entity, they could essentially shut war out. But even their legal system lacked a true, a comprehensive, just framework for when and how war could be waged beyond some religious limitations.
I was struck by the detail about Aristotle condemning states that were only focused on war, like the Lacedaemonians.
Absolutely. It shows there was thinking even then about the purpose of a state and whether constant warfare was a noble end in itself.
Yeah.
And the sources point out glimmers of developing ethical considerations even in warfare, referencing figures like Fabricius and Regulus in Rome, showing hints of honor emerging in conflict.
And Socrates apparently saw war between Greeks as different from fighting non-Greeks. More like a family argument, discord only, a quarrel among friends.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? It suggests a recognition of a shared identity beginning to influence the perception of conflict. Then the sources shift focus to the Jewish perspective, where warfare gets tied deeply to religion.
Right. This is where you see an eye for an eye and the idea of Jehovah as the Lord of hosts, sometimes commanding war, even extermination against enemies like the Canaanites.
Right, and the sources make a significant point here. Unlike polytheistic systems, which could be quite tolerant of other gods, monotheism, particularly as expressed here, is seen as inherently intolerant towards other faiths.
How so?
Well, the presence of other gods or idolaters was seen as an insult to the one invisible God. It wasn't necessarily about forced conversion, as we'd see later, but often about the absolute rejection, even extermination, of those who worship differently, seen as an act of supreme loyalty.
Okay, so that brings us to the church. You might expect a religion founded by the Prince of Peace to be, well, unequivocally peaceful. But the sources show it's far more complex.
It truly is. While Christ is called the Prince of Peace, he also spoke of bringing a sword, which, has been interpreted in many ways. But early figures like Justin Martyr, Clement, Tertullian, Origen, they seemed pretty clear.
They gave strong testimony against war, didn't they? Viewing the soldier's life, the shedding of blood, as contrary to Christian calling. Tertullian apparently asked if it was even lawful for a Christian to be a soldier when the Lord said those who live by the sword die by it.
That's a powerful stance. But the sources show this attitude changed dramatically over time. External pressures, particularly the rise of Islamic power, contributed to the church developing a much less peace-loving character.
And this leads eventually to the Crusades, framed in the sources as holy wars against infidels. A new, aggressive form of conflict enters history.
Exactly. The sources detail the church's significant power and aggressiveness in the Middle Ages, wrestling with emperors, issuing bans, even pursuing princes, and they highlight what seems like an incredible anomaly: fighting clergy.
Fighting clergy, priests in battle.
Priests and bishops leading men in battle, yeah, existing for over 1,000 years.
Wow. An anomaly Erasmus, according to the sources, absolutely condemned, seeing it as impious for priests to spill blood. He took a very strong stance, almost absolute, on peace. The most iniquitous peace is better than the most just war.
A fascinating counterpoint to thinkers like Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, who, as the sources note, grappled with and ultimately justified war, provided it was fought for a just cause. So even within Christianity, you see this deep tension about the role and legitimacy of violence.
Okay, so moving on. Emerging from the chaos of feudalism, where private wars were common, the modern state starts to take shape.
And this is a major shift. Private warfare becomes illegal. War becomes the exclusive domain of kings and states. And crucially, peace is now theoretically the normal condition of society, with war being the disruption.
Right, the baseline changes.
Exactly.
This new landscape spurred the development of international law. The sources point to Grotius in the late 16th, early 17th century as a pivotal figure.
Grotius attempts to lay down ethical principles for how states should interact, a higher law for the society of nations, drawing on, well, divine origin and human reason. He sees states as equal under natural law.
But here's a key insight from the sources. Grotius didn't try to abolish war.
No, he accepted it as a fact, calling it the natural method for settling disputes. While acknowledging it was a terrible scourge, it was, in his view, sanctioned by practice and law. And crucially, violations of international law in this early stage could ultimately only be settled by war. It was the only form of, let's say, legal procedure available between sovereign states.
Okay, so international law emerges, but war is still the final arbiter. This must have sparked some people to think, surely we can do better than this.
Absolutely. And the sources introduced some early practical peace projects. There's the famous Grand Design, sometimes linked to Henry IV and Sully, proposing a federation of Christian sovereigns in Europe.
And then the Abbé Saint-Pierre, who apparently drew up a really detailed blueprint.
Yes, a very comprehensive plan for a permanent union of states, a common assembly, sanctions, a joint military force. The sources highlight his plan's thoroughness, but point to his key mistake, believing it could be implemented almost immediately. His unpractical enthusiasm, as it's termed, led to sort of ironic reactions from people like Voltaire and Leibniz, who saw it as a lovely but, unattainable dream.
So visionary, but maybe unrealistic for the time. Rousseau took Saint-Pierre more seriously, apparently, but also doubted sovereigns would ever actually agree, seeing things like standing armies as a major barrier, a plague on society.
And this brings us squarely to the intellectual foundation Kant builds upon, particularly the ideas of Hobbes.
Hobbes, famous for describing the state of nature as a state of war. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Right. For Hobbes, peace is simply security from violence. And because human nature is seen as fundamentally self-interested and untrustworthy in that state, security requires coercive power, the state, not just promises or agreements.
So the state exists pretty much to lift us out of that dangerous natural condition.
Exactly. Hobbes saw war as a natural condition between European states, but believed rules for its conduct and prevention, like mediation, were necessary. But if peace efforts failed, war remained the alternative.
I remember the quote.
As the sources quote Hobbes, every man ought to endeavor peace when he cannot obtain it, seek and use all helps and advantages of war. It's a pragmatic, almost bleak view of the necessity of force.
Now, Kant takes this idea of antagonism, but uses it in a slightly different, almost optimistic way, which the sources describe through the concept of nature's unsociableness.
This is such a key Kantian insight. It's the idea that humans have this fundamental tension within them, an inclination to live in society, but also a deep resistance to it, a drive for self-interest and conflict.
Unsociableness. So we want to be together, but we also kind of rub each other the wrong way.
Precisely. And Kant, as presented in the sources, sees nature using this very antagonism, this competition, this friction, as the engine that actually drives human development. The insecurity, the uncertainty, the evils of the state of nature push individuals, despite themselves, to seek civil society and order,
Hmm.
Culture, art, even the state itself are seen as products of this very self-loving unsociableness. The friction creates the polish in a way.
Wow, so our worst tendencies are actually what compel us towards something better.
That's counterintuitive. That's the Kantian twist nature provides. And he applies this to states too. States, like individuals, existing in a lawless state of nature where war is always a threat, cannot remain permanent or secure. War, and the crushing burden of preparing for it, are the evils that force states to eventually leave this condition and seek a union under law. External peace, for Kant, is ultimately dependent on state having a just internal structure first.
Which brings us neatly to Kant's vision of perpetual peace. The sources frame it not just as a nous idea, but as a moral ideal, an idea of duty.
Yes, something we are morally obligated to desire and actively work towards. And here's another crucial insight from the sources. Kant believed this ideal was not only necessary but practicable.
Practicable, really?
He saw it as guaranteed not by some sudden change in human goodness, but by the natural course of human propensities themselves, that mechanism of unsociableness pushing us towards it, even if we can't predict the exact timeline.
So it's not a far-off utopia that may or may not happen. It's a guiding principle that dictates our actions now because nature is sort of nudging us in that direction anyway.
Exactly. And Kant, being Kant, gives us a systematic approach in his treatise on perpetual peace, structured around what he calls definitive articles.
The first definitive article, the civil constitution must be republican.
And his logic here is very practical. In non-republican states, rulers, whether kings or others, can decide on war almost casually, like organizing a pleasure party, for trifling reasons.
Why? Because they don't bear the cost themselves.
Exactly. They aren't the ones who directly suffer the war's hardships, the fighting, the debt, the loss.
But in a republican state where the citizens who have to decree all the hardships of war, the fighting, the taxes, the death, have the say,
they are going to be far more hesitant and cautious about starting a war. It just makes sense. The sources emphasize that for Kant, the key isn't just the name republic, but the representative system where citizens' voices are heard and matter in the decision to go to war. Without that, even a state called a republic can be despotic.
Okay, so just internal constitution isn't enough. You need a structure between states. That's the second article. The law of nations shall be founded on a federation of free states.
Kant compares states living next to each other without any common external law to individuals in that dangerous state of nature, constantly threatening and injuring one another just by their proximity. Every state, for its own security, is justified in demanding its neighbor enter into a structure like its own, a civil constitution, but on an international level. Civilized races, he argues, must leave this lawless condition.
But the sources also mention the state's inherent pride, its majesty, in not being subject to any external authority. This is where the depravity of human nature is most evident in state relations, right? That stubborn insistence on absolute sovereignty.
Right. And because of this, Kant argues, words and treaties between states lack real legal force. There's no higher authority to enforce them reliably. It's just promises without teeth.
So what's the solution? Why not just one big world republic? That seems simpler.
The sources make Kant's case against that. A single world state, he believed, would mean the wider the jurisdiction, the weaker the laws would become in practice. It would be too unwieldy, leading inevitably to despotism on a massive scale, and eventually chaos and anarchy.
Okay, so not one world government, but a federation.
Yes. The sources present this as Kant's practicable ideal. A league, a union where states retain their sovereignty in many ways, but agree to abide by international law, ideally enforced collectively.
And what could help make this happen, beyond just good intentions?
Well, the sources highlight self-interest, particularly the practical binding force of the spirit of commerce. Trade creates shared interests that make peace profitable and war disruptive to business.
That leads perfectly into the third article. Cosmopolitan law, the rights of men as citizens of the world shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. Sounds grand.
It does, but it's often misunderstood. It's not giving everyone the right to settle anywhere they want. It's simply the right of a stranger not to be treated as an enemy upon arrival in another territory. It's a permission to attempt intercourse, to visit and engage peacefully.
And this right is essential for facilitating interaction between distant peoples, eventually bringing them under some form of international law.
Exactly. And the sources echo the point about commerce again, noting that the practical need for international communication and trade makes this kind of cosmopolitan right a commonplace of law driven by commercial interests as much as abstract right.
But then the sources starkly contrast this ideal with the historical reality, the inhospitable behavior of the civilized nations.
Yes, especially the European commercial states. The examples are, frankly, sobering. Treating newly discovered lands like America or the Spice Islands as empty, belonging to nobody, simply because the native inhabitants were viewed as irrelevant or obstacles.
Leading to wars, oppression, slavery, like the terrible conditions mentioned in the Sugar Islands. And it drove places like China and Japan to severely restrict European access due precisely to these past violent, greedy interactions disguised as trade.
And here's an interesting detail the sources include. Even with all this injustice and violence, the trading companies often found themselves on the verge of ruin, and slavery, despite its immense cruelty, yielded no real profit in the end.
Suggesting injustice doesn't even pay.
Perhaps. It suggests that injustice and exploitation aren't just morally wrong, but maybe ultimately self-defeating in the long run, too.
So if humans often fail to do what they ought to do morally, how does nature guarantee this progress towards peace? You mentioned the mechanism.
This loops back to the mechanism of nature we discussed earlier. Nature uses our flaws, our self-seeking, our antagonism, not some sudden moral transformation we can't count on.
Right.
It pits forces against each other within states so they check destructive activity. It's the mechanism, the consequence of our actions, that pushes us almost against our will sometimes.
So war itself is, paradoxically, a tool nature uses in this framework.
In this Kantian view, yes. War, though terrible, disperses humans, forcing them to populate even inhospitable regions like the Arctic or deserts, leading to wider interaction eventually. And commerce, driven by basic needs like salt and iron, compels distant peoples into peaceful relations over time.
And the sources also mention that nature uses differences like language and religion to keep nations separate, not just cause conflict.
Yes, preventing the formation of that single, suffocating universal monarchy that Kant feared would become a despotism. Difference in this sense serves a purpose in maintaining a balance of power and preventing tyranny.
And ultimately, the sheer burden of war, whether it's happening now or just the constant threat and cost of preparation, forces states, despite their pride, to reconsider that lawless state of nature and seek union under law.
That's the core of nature's guarantee. It makes perpetual peace likely, maybe even inevitable, in the long run. Not as a certainty we can predict, like a scientific experiment, but clearly enough to make striving for it our practical and moral duty now.
The sources also bring up the idea that philosophers should have a role here, that their opinions on war and peace should actually be considered by states. Seems a bit idealistic.
It's presented as a modest suggestion, acknowledging states might be hesitant to appear guided by academics, the dignity issue. But the sources argue it's advisable.
And the key seems to be that states should simply allow philosophers to discuss these matters freely and publicly, not necessarily follow their advice directly.
Right. Philosophers, the sources say, aren't really a threat. They're generally incapable of rebellion or serious political agitation. They should be free to speak their minds openly, to enlighten rulers and the public, because they will naturally do so if not suppressed. Let the ideas circulate.
This idea of open discussion leads nicely into the appendix and a key tool Kant provides, the publicity principle. The appendix discusses the potential conflict between morals and politics. Morals say be guileless as doves, follow duty unconditionally. Politics says be wise as serpents, pursue expediency. Can these two ever truly align?
Kant argues they must align, and the publicity principle is his test. It's essentially a negative test for injustice. An action relating to public right is wrong if its underlying principle, its maxim, cannot be made public without defeating its own purpose. It's a test rooted in reason itself, an a priori check.
Okay, let's test it with the examples. Take constitutional law and the right of revolution. Can a ruler openly state they'll execute rebels?
According to Kant's logic here, yes. The sources explain this maxim is consistent with the necessary idea of irresistible sovereign power in a state. If rebels succeed, they establish a new power, and the old ruler isn't accountable under the new system anyway. It passes the test in that specific, rather harsh sense. The sources contrast this with how Hobbes and Locke wrestled with similar ideas.
Okay, that's a tough one. What about international law? Can a state secretly plan to break a treaty if it thinks it's necessary for its safety, essentially leading a double life?
Absolutely not, according to the principle. If a state were to make public the principle, I will break treaties whenever it suits my immediate needs, what would happen? Other states would immediately avoid that state or unite against it. The principle defeats its own end of using treaties deceitfully for advantage. It fails the publicity test. It's unjust.
Makes sense. And what about aggressive expansion or preemptive war? Can a state announce it will annex its neighbor just because it has the power? Or attack a peaceful state just because it might pose a threat in the future, what's called probabilism?
Again, these fail the publicity test. Publicizing the maxim, might makes right, I'll annex you, invites immediate resistance and alliances against the aggressor, undermining the goal of easy expansion. Publicizing the principle of attacking based on mere probability of future bad intent also defeats its purpose. It justifies any attack and makes any neighbor a potential target, destroying any possibility of trust or stability. Neither maxim can stand the light of day without collapsing its own goal.
So the sources really emphasize that politics must ultimately defer to morals, not the other way around. The moral politician acts from duty derived from reason.
Precisely. And unethical politics relying on deception, mental reservation, probabilism, tricky casuistry, it naturally shuns the light. Philosophy, by publishing maxims and testing them with the publicity principle, helps expose this injustice.
And there's a thought about providence here too, isn't there? That even when wrong actions like wars fueled by ill will happen, nature uses the mutual destruction, short of total extermination, to serve a purpose.
Yes, the idea is that the survivors learn from the terrible consequences. Providence isn't about blessing the war itself, but ensuring that the moral principle persists in humanity, and reason's capacity to realize right grows stronger over time. Even as the guilt of those who cause war might increase, nature works through consequences.
We've coupled ancient history, the church, international law, and Kant's detailed plan. Finally, the sources bring us forward to look at the persistent challenges and debates about peace and war, even into the modern era discussed in the texts.
They certainly do. They present the arguments for war that have continued through history, that it develops virtues like courage and sacrifice, prevents cultural stagnation, avoids materialism, and has even acted as an architect of nations. Thinkers like Hegel, Moltke, Schiller, Tennyson are mentioned in this context.
The romantic, maybe even necessary view of war, but the counter-arguments are stark, especially with modern technology.
Indeed. The crushing cost of modern conflict described as a new distemper, the exponentially increasing bloodshed due to advanced weapons, and the terrifying potential for utter extermination.
What about tools like arbitration? The sources discuss that as a potential path.
They note its progress, which is important.
Yeah.
Arbitration has successfully settled many trifling causes, things like boundary disputes, financial claims, contract issues. It shows legal methods can work between states.
But there's a but, isn't there?
A big but. The sources state clearly it has never resolved a supreme conflict, one involving existential threats or core questions of national honor. It cannot replace war in those ultimate instances, and critically, it's not compulsory for states. They can just ignore it.
And the crushing burden of modern armaments, si vis pacem, parabellum, if you want peace, prepare for war. That seems like a huge driver towards disarmament, yet the sources point out why that's so incredibly hard.
Yeah, the difficulties include wildly differing national circumstances, geography, history, perceived threats, and the fundamental lack of a universal standard for what constitutes proportionate disarmament. How do you even measure it fairly? It's a persistent deadlock.
The Peace Society is mentioned, working tirelessly for the cause.
Yes, described as untiring supporters, though perhaps sometimes focusing too much on abstract ideals or phrases. The sources suggest that real progress in reducing war's causes might owe more to the rising influence of the general population, particularly in industrial societies, who increasingly oppose war out of sheer self-interest because it's simply death to their interests.
Okay, and there's also the persistent objection that perpetual peace or federation would lead to stagnation, a loss of national identity, ending productive struggle, that conflict is necessary for dynamism.
The counterpoint offered in the sources is that this is pretty unlikely to completely erase conflict, rivalry, or cultural differences. Competition would likely just continue in other forms, economic, cultural, scientific.
And that tricky balance between peace and justice. Is peace always the highest value?
The sources raise this important point, citing Martineau, that prioritizing reverence for human life above all else, even justice and right, can become a kind of immoral idolatry. Sometimes force is necessary, like a policeman using force or a fortress representing necessary constraint compared to a handcuff. A war, in this view, could potentially be right in certain extreme circumstances.
So it's definitely not simply peace at any price.
Exactly. The perspective shifts. War used to be the rule, now peace is the norm, but war remains an overwhelming and terrible exception, a destructive interruption. Peace is now the true engine of culture, inter arma, musae silent. Among arms, the muses are silent.
And the sources seem to land on the idea of finding an intermediate path. Not expecting unbroken peace anytime soon, but working towards it as Kant's ideal. The goal becomes making unjustifiable aggression incredibly difficult and eliminating the flimsy excuses states use to wage war.
They even float the provocative idea that conflict within Europe might increasingly be seen as a form of civil war, painful, a transition, but always a stain. And perhaps, they suggest, one more decisive war might yet be required to truly unite Europe, a rather striking and maybe unsettling thought to end on from that era's perspective.
So we've taken this incredible deep dive, haven't we? Tracing the human struggle for peace from ancient battlefields and religious conflicts through the dawn of international law and early, perhaps naive, peace plans, to Kant's incredibly detailed philosophical and practical framework, and finally to the ongoing debates and challenges right up to the modern era covered in these texts.
We've seen peace not just as an absence of war, but framed variously as a rare exception and a desirable norm, a practical political goal, a fundamental moral duty, and yes, perhaps still, in its ultimate perfect form, a distant ideal.
What's really struck me digging through these sources is how the quest for peace isn't just about treaties or armies or politics in a narrow sense. It's fundamentally tied to our human nature, to historical forces, and to core moral philosophy. You can't really separate them.
And Kant gives us that powerful idea. Even if perpetual peace seems incredibly far off, the sources suggest that the effort towards it, guided by principles of right like the publicity principle, is not only our duty, but a genuinely practical path forward. And it's one that nature itself, through the tough consequences of our own conflicts, seems to be pushing us towards, whether we like it or not.
Okay, here's a final thought for you to really mull over after this deep dive. If, as these sources suggest about Kant's view, nature uses our own conflicts and destructive tendencies as a mechanism to drive us towards a more peaceful order, does that mean that some form of conflict, some level of struggle, is actually an essential, maybe even necessary, part of the journey towards a more peaceful future? Something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.